spomen megalitskih građevina misao prvo krene prema Egiptu ili Južnoj Americi, poznatima po svojim piramidama i drugim kolosalnim građevinama. Sve je očiglednije da ti krajevi svijeta nisu ekskluzivni. Već smo predstavljali megalitske gradove Dalmacije, Bosne, Hercegovine, Crne Gore pa sve do Makedonije. Moguće je da je prije 10.000 godina Jadranski bazen bio dom neke zaboravljene kulture, iza koje nije ostalo ništa osim megalitskih ostataka. Ako ih ima s ove strane Jadrana pa sve do Makedonije, bilo presmjelo očekivati slične ostatke iz druge strane Jadrana, u Italiji pa čak i u Grčkoj. Istraživač megalita Gary Biltcliffe nije ih tražio, ali ih je ipak našao. Zato smo se susreli ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Sve vas pozdravljam. Gary Biltcliffe, autor je knjige Spirit of Portland, inače cijeli život je posvetio istraživanju megalita u Meksiku, Peru, Sjevernoj Americi, Egiptu, Europi, Australiji. Također knjiga Spirit of Portland upravo se i bavi megalitima, odnosno tragovima Feničana na tom britanskom poluotoku. Kada se prije 5 godina našao u Italiji na turističkom putovanju, konačno je otkrio tragove megalita i tamo gdje se sve prepisivalo Rimljanima ili možda Etrušćanima. I tako smo se večeras našli ovdje da vidimo kakvi se sve megalitski tragovi kriju s druge strane Jadranskog mora u ovom istom Jadranskom bazenu u kojem smo već prije proučavali megalite diljem Dalmacije, diljem zaleđa Dalmacije i sl. Dobar dan, dobro večer. Gdje na svijetu ima najviše megalitskih mjesta i kakve su predodžbe u svijesti ljudi koje su to nekako, možemo reći, megalitske zemlje?
One of the greatest areas of the world that has a large concentration of megaliths is in Peru, Bolivia, in England. There's lots of megaliths across Europe, around the coasts, as far as North Africa. But the megalithic cities really fascinated me more than the average megaliths because they are truly megalith in their size and the way that they are built, the way the stones are put together and the sheer size of them.
Postoji predodžba da su nekakva posebna megalitska mjesta, neka od ovih koje ste spomenuli, Egipat, Peru i sl. Međutim, istraživači poput vas i neki drugi pokazali su da megalitskih tragova i gradova ima praktički svugdje. Gdje ste sve otkrivali megalitske gradove i tragove, a da to ne bismo očekivali?
We have found megalithic cities all over the central spine of Italy, the Apennine Mountains, and along the coast. And very few people visit them. They're off the tourist trail. And when you do visit them, the information boards say that they are Roman or Etruscan. And this doesn't fit with what we experienced on our tour of Etruscan cities around Italy. So it appeared to us that these great megalithic walls were made by an earlier culture who had a sophisticated way of cutting, moving and lifting stone.
Može li se reći da je otkriće neke megalitske povijesti na Apeninskom poluotoku za vas bilo svojevrsno iznenađenje?
It was a surprise for us because we couldn't believe that they would say these were Roman walls because I experienced Roman sites all over Europe and there is nothing like these walls. If the Romans were proficient at building these walls, then we'd find them in other Roman areas of Europe. But they seem particular to Italy, Greece and other parts of the Adriatic.
Počecima kulture i povijesti na europskom kontinentu uobičajeno smatramo Grčku i Rim. Naravno, postoje tu još neki misteriozni narodi prije o kojima se ne zna puno, Etrušćani, Pelazgi i slično. Smatrate li da su na tim istim područjima živjele i neke starije civilizacije kojima danas nema traga ili naš trag u povijesti završava kod Etrušćana?
We've discovered that many of the old cities that have these megalithic walls are attributed to an ancient race called the Pelasgians. who are supposed to have founded Greece and Italy thousands of years ago. And that these people have stayed in the area, maybe have mixed with the Etruscans, and maybe some cross-culture and techniques have been passed down to later civilizations. But I believe that these great megalithic walls were definitely built by an earlier race, maybe the Plastians, or another culture that we're not sure of the name, but they were sea peoples, according to the traditions of the areas around these megalithic walls. So they could be Phoenician, but then Phoenician is just another word for red-haired people. There's no actual name that describes these people who built the megalithic cities.
Možda se čini nemoguće ono što ćemo sad učiniti, a to je da tu u studiju, sjedeći u studiju, napravimo šetnju kroz rimsku povijest, pretpovijest i kroz megalit, ali ipak ćemo to napraviti zahvaljujući vašim slikama i naravno zahvaljujući vašim komentarima. Pa krenimo redom kroz razne megalitske lokacije po Italiji, a onda i po Grčkoj. Pa da vidimo što je to rimsko, što je to etrušćansko, što je možda iz nekog davnog zaboravljenog vremena. Recimo, zanimljive megalite ste našli u Mikeni. Gdje ste to slikali i što oni prikazuju?
This picture shows an incredibly large megalithic block at the entrance to the treasury of Atreus at the site Mycenae on the Peloponnese in Greece. Again, they say that these structures were around 1500 BC, which is, of course, before Roman, but nevertheless, the sheer size of these blocks, weighing some over 50 tons, which today our engineers would struggle to lift with the latest cranes. They're there to be seen, and so we have to marvel at how they managed to cut, move, and shape these blocks. So the blocks of Mycenae are a good example of a megalithic site.
Što je sa onim pričama o stotinama i tisućama robova, kakve obično vidimo u dokumentarcima, u dokumentarnim filmovima o gradnji piramida, kako oznojeni vuku teške blokove uzbrdo?
Well, many of these blocks have been cut in a particular way, and so it requires a stonemason to be there at the time to cut each block and place them. It's unlikely with the positioning of these blocks that they would have large gangs to move them into place. And why should they? Why don't they just use smaller stones? Why do they need to have great blocks like that, unless it was easy for them to do it?
Posjetili ste 12 etrušćanskih gradova, ili ih se bar tako danas naziva, pa evo na sljedećoj slici opet vidimo neku kombinaciju zidova. Teško je općenito na ovakvim mjestima naći granice ponekad gdje počne jedna kultura, gdje prestaje druga, jedna kopira drugu i slično. Što je tako zanimljivo na ovoj slici da ste uslikali?
On our tour of Italy, we decided to explore the 12 ancient cities of the Etruscans because we were fascinated with the Etruscan culture. Because, it's said that they founded Western civilization and not the Romans. So we wanted to have a feel for the Etruscan sites. So we visited all the well-known sites like Veii, Tarquinia and Vulci. And we noticed that the Etruscan masonry is pretty typical of squared blocks with curved stones near the bottom, like a cornice. And there's a distinct style of masonry to the Etruscans. So it was a mystery to us why some of the so-called Etruscan sites were very different.
I evo nas časkom i u Toskani, gdje se nalaze kiklopski zidovi, kakve možemo i vidjeti. Kojem rukopisu pripadaju ti zidovi?
When we arrived in Roselle, which is one of the minor cities of the Etruscans, we was expecting to see typical Etruscan masonry. But instead we found these great cyclopean walls made of large boulders that have been roughly shaped and then cut at the face to make it aesthetically pleasing. These walls reminded us of the walls at Tiryns in Greece because of their Cyclopean way. And Cyclopean actually means made from the legendary giant Cyclops, because Homer says that this style of masonry in Greece were built by giants, and Cyclops was a mythical giant. So the walls of Roselle were more like those ancient walls of Tiryns, which are supposed to date from 3000 BC. But the walls of Roselle were dated to Roman times. And we could see inside the ruins of Roselle that there were typical Roman remains, but nothing like the outer walls.
No slične se slike zidova mogu vidjeti u knjigama koje se bave Južnom Amerikom, pogotovo još onim njenim južnim dijelom gdje zna biti stvarno ogromnih stijena u zidovima.
Yes, but mostly in South America the blocks are what they call polygonal, which means they are shaped with different angles and placed together without any gap, with no mortar, in a fashion that is almost what I call impossible masonry, because it's so difficult to get each piece to lock into the next piece. But we found that this technique is earthquake-proof, because when the ground shakes, the polygonal walls can move freely and even tighten up, whereas squared blocks mortared together would shatter.
Meni još i danas teško složiti obične puzzle dječje. Pa pomislio da je netko to isto radio sa blokovima od 15 tona. Djeluje zastrašujuće. Evo, sljedeća slika nas vodi u mjesto Koza. U čemu se, to je znači isti rukopis zidova kako smo već vidjeli.
Now, at Kosa we found a different type of wall to Roselle. And again, Kosa was supposed to be a Roman fort, fortification near a port. There was hardly any signposts taking us to this site. We had a great difficulty in locating it. And when we did find it, there was no parking area, and there was just a small box, a bit of information that said this is all a Roman site. And then we walked along this lane and saw these walls, and we was blown away, because this was truly polygonal. Each stone is a different size, cut to a different angle. And we recognize this is more like the ruins of South America than the sort of typically Etruscan walls.
U sljedećim slikama možemo gledati kako su kulture gazile jedna drugu, ovako figurativno rečeno. To je znači točno ono mjesto gdje je poučno promatrati kako su se smjenjivale kulture i što je zapravo od onih najdoljnjih ostalo. Kakve pouke možemo izvući iz ovih slika?
Well, this is a great example of showing you an earlier and later cultures. On the top layer we have typically Roman remains, and then just underneath that you see the typical Etruscan squared masonry with the curved stones. And then below that, deep below that, there were these polygonal walls. And yet, you know, the guidebook says that all three walls are roughly from the Roman period, slightly before. But here we could see a progression of wall building from the most sophisticated in polygonal to the most simple in Roman. So I think Kosa is a great site to visit to see that the polygonal walls are older than Roman.
Čini se da vas nije lako zadovoljiti turističkim vodičima.
No.
Ovdje evo nas i kod nekoliko sličica koji će nam pokazati kako to izgleda na drugim kontinentima, konkretno u Južnoj Americi, pa onda u Egiptu. To je ono o čemu pričate, veliki blokovi, poligonalni.
Yes, fitted together with no mortar, each stone a different angle, different size. It's almost pre-Diluvian masonry. A lot of people say the Sphinx Temple was built at 3000 BC, maybe earlier. Some researchers say it goes back to 9000 BC. But we're seeing in the earliest ruins across the world this polygonal type masonry. It's a wonder to behold.
Tko su uopće bili ti Pelazgi prema predajama ili možda nekim povjesničarima iz davnih vremena?
Well, the Pelasgians say that they say the Pelasgians were an ancient race that founded Italy and Greece thousands and thousands of years ago. But at Kossa, the site we'd just seen previously, there is a local tradition that this site was built by the Pelasgians. And George Dennis, who wrote a wonderful book called The Cemeteries of Etruria, also talks about two other sites of the Pelasgians at Pigri, and Saturnia. And so we thought maybe this polygonal masonry is from this early race, the Pelasgians. Homer said the Pelasgians were around during the Trojan War, and that they took the side of the Trojans. So, I mean, that's going back to 1200 BC. But they say that the Pelasgians have been around for thousands of years before, and that they were a seafaring race. They were Caucasian, bearded, and they were great stonemasons.
Pelazgi su nam važni jer eto, Saturnija je mjesto koje se po nekima smatra prvim gradom koji su Pelazgi izgradili u Italiji. Što nam ove slike prikazuju? Koliko je ostalo od pelazgske gradnje?
This is true, and yet again the guidebook, the information board says that Saturnia is a Roman site, but the local people, the local traditions say that this was one of the most ancient cities built by the Pelasgians. So on our visit there, we decided to look at the Roman gate, and at the Roman gate you can see polygonal masonry interlinked with the Roman masonry. And these were large blocks of travertine limestone, which is almost like marble. It's a very hard stone. It's not an easy stone to cut, and yet they were able to lift large blocks to great height.
Mjesto Lazio, također navodno rimski sajt, zapravo rimsko mjesto je drevna rimska luka. Što za to kažu povjesničari? Što vama kaže vaše poznavanje megalitske kulture?
Lazio. Well, again, they say that the earliest writers say that the city was a Pelasgian, and that it was around during the time of the Trojan War, and that it was built before the Trojan War, in fact. And also the style of the masonry we saw there was typically polygonal, exactly like all the other cities that were said to be Pelasgian. And you can even see a sunken harbour there where the polygonal walls go into the sea.
Da li nam taj podatak da su ti zidovi danas pod vodom može govoriti nešto o njihovoj starosti? S obzirom da je Graham Hancock u svojoj knjizi Underworld zapravo krenuo tragom starih civilizacija ne na obalama, nego ispod mora. Jer je zaključio da ako se dogodila kataklizma, da bi prethodni krug civilizacije i njihove građevine zapravo trebale biti uz obale pod vodom.
It's true. I think it shows the great age at Pigri because the sea levels have changed since this great harbour was built, and it could be that the Mediterranean was changed with either flooding or some natural disaster that changed the sea levels. It's possible, but if you actually stand there and see these walls going into the sea, you cannot help to think that it's very, very ancient walls.
Evo zanimljive slike koja prikazuje susret moderne civilizacije jako drevne. Pretpostavljam da vam ovaj automobil nije bio glavna meta vašeg fotoaparata. O čemu se radi na ovoj slici?
This picture is taken from Emilia, which is in the center of Italy, the geographical center almost. And again, it's said to be a city of the Pelasgi, according to the local people and historians, but the official history says that it's Roman. And so we were actually blown away by these walls because they were some of the finest polygonal walls we had seen. And as you can see from the picture, they're extremely large blocks, and the standard of masonry was superb because I think some of these walls were actually covered so that they were in good condition. You can see the fine jointing. And Emilia is a great example of a polygonal city.
Zanimljivo je da su ti zidovi, evo još uvijek ovdje, česti primjer da su ljudi starije građevine razmontiravali, uzimali kamenje i gradili svoje nove kuće. Međutim, iz nekog razloga ove zidove je očito bilo vrlo teško razrušiti, a pogotovo čovjek ne bi znao što da radi sa poligonalnim kamenjem.
They've survived the test of time. When they built these walls, they built them to last. And they survived earthquakes, because Emilia is an area of earthquakes, and the walls have stood for probably hundreds of earthquakes, whereas the Roman walls have all fallen down. And I think the locals also respect that these were built by a great race of people, their ancestors. Yeah, they proved the test of time. They're still standing. And they were built by incredibly sophisticated stonemasons, because to put those blocks together, it's almost impossible. You have to cut each one to fit the other. So many people have a theory that they were cut by laser or water jets. Lasers would shatter the edges of the stone. They were clean cuts, as if they'd cut through the stone like butter, or cut out a mountain side of stone and then take it away and put it back.
Što mislite o teoriji onog Francuza kojem ne mogu izgovoriti ime, koji je još prije 20 godina pokazao da su možda veliki blokovi nekakva napredna vrst betona? U prilog tome su govorili nalazi dlaka unutar blokova, pa onda veća gustoća na donjim krajevima blokova, što bi donekle i objasnilo ono što se nama čini nemoguće, manipuliranje velikim blokovima. Možemo li naći nekakvu vezu između njegove teorije i evo ovih zidova, kao što je on našao između egipatskih?
Yes, I know this theory well, and it could well be true that some of the pyramid blocks were poured into a mold and then placed. But if you have a knowledge of geology and you look at the rock and see sea creatures in them and lines where the seabed is settled, they certainly weren't poured in any mold or from any liquid source, because they still contain the layers, if you like, geological layers within many of the stones. Because it would make sense, you know, why not have... But then if you had molds, each mold would have to be a different shape. You know, they'd all be the same shape.
Znači, opet imamo isti problem. Na ovoj karti vidimo 20 etrušćanskih gradova. Tko su zapravo bili Etrušćani prema današnjim saznanjima, možda prema nekim vašim saznanjima? Što je za njih ostalo? U kojoj mjeri su oni bili značajni, možda više za prošlost nego za budućnost Rimskog carstva?
Well, the Etruscans were a very influential race. They were very highly religious. They weren't a warring race in any respect, but they were great engineers, great stone builders, great masons. But there is one site in Italy that is Etruscan at Seveteri. And there we find in one of their necropolises, which necropolis is the place of the dead, their cemeteries, which they always had separate from the Acropolis. We find that the necropolis of the Etruscans are far larger areas than the Acropolis, so the dead to them was more important than the living. And these tombs are all different at Seveteri. Some are typically Etruscan with the curbstones and the squared blocks. But then we also find round tumuli, chambered tombs, that have almost an oriental feel to them. And these have been cut from solid rock at the base and then stoned in a dome. And other ones we found were polygonal, but smaller. So we were seeing all styles here, and it was our conclusion that this burial ground was not only a burial ground of the Etruscans, but previous races as well, including probably the Pelasgians.
Prošli ćemo sada do mjesta koje se zove Alatrija. Kakve ste nas slike od tamo donijeli?
Alatri, again, we'd researched the area for any signs of Pelasgian cities, and south of Rome, we come to hear about Alatri because of the great walls there, said to be Roman again, but as we arrived there, these were magnificent walls that had seemed to have survived the ages, the weathering, and their height was tremendous, over 10 meters high. And some of the blocks in the walls, weighing over 10 tons, were high up in the wall. There was no regularity. Most Greek masonry, they start with the largest stones at the bottom and then get smaller as they go up. But here we had some of the largest stones 5 meters up in the air, as if they were showing off their skills and abilities to cut, move and position these stones. Because remember, they've only probably got one chance of taking this stone up and it fitting into place. Otherwise, they'd have to keep taking it out, chipping a bit more off, take it out again a bit more until they get it right. But obviously, they somehow had all these stones cut out before assembling them. But I was very impressed with the Alatri.
Slične prizore može se vidjeti u mjestu Norba, također u Italiji.
Yes, Norba was one of my favorite sites because here we have a polygonal round tower. Now, not only is it difficult to place these stones together, but the masons who built this city actually carved the stones into a curve. So this really for me was the pinnacle of polygonal walling in Italy. And I haven't seen anything like this apart from South America, in Peru, where you do get these round polygonal walls.
To bi bio pravi izazov za $1 milijun, sagraditi ovakav zid. Kad nađemo nekog tko bi to htio financirati. Skočimo na trenutak u Grčku. Piramide obično poistovjećujemo s Egiptom, svi znaju da ih ima u Južnoj Americi, no po mnogim istraživačima skoro da nema kontinenta gdje ih nema. Satelitske snimke preko Google Eartha pokazuju njihovu rasprostranjenost, čak i u Kini gdje ih ima u stotinama. No evo jedne piramidice možemo nazvati u Grčkoj. Gdje se ona nalazi i je li ona poznata, ima li nje u turističkim vodičima?
The pyramid is called Hellenikon. It's on the Peloponnese and it's on the eastern side of the Peloponnese, not too far from Mycenae. And again, it's not in the guidebooks, it's not a tourist attraction, it's not a place people will find in their guidebooks easily. But when you arrive at the place, you can instantly see we have a pyramid. And we managed to access the site, and we found there's an inner chamber, a passage, and a vent shaft, which to me was like, why do you need ventilation for the dead, you know, unless the living were actually using these chambers as well. And it was polygonal. So this interested me because the legends of the Pelasgians say that they settled in Arcadia, which today they reckon was the Peloponnese. So on the Peloponnese, in the very area of Arcadia, we found one of probably the ultimate expression of polygonal masonry in a pyramid. So and interestingly, recently, scientists from different universities have done optical thermoluminescence dating on these stones, which is basically the atomic level affecting the molecules is changed when sunlight first hits the stone coming out of a quarry. And they can rate the disintegration of this sunlight from the time it was quarried. So they'd actually dated these walls to 2710 BC, which is actually older than the pyramid, 100 years older than the Great Pyramid in Egypt. So if this is true, then the Pelasgians were obviously building at the same time as the pyramids in Egypt.
Ostanemo još malo u Grčkoj, u mjesto koje bi se zvalo Oinijada. Eto ovdje još jednog izazova za sve zidare. Zid napravljen od potpuno različitog kamenja. Gdje se to nalazi i šta nam ove slike govore iz tog mjesta?
The site you're seeing is Oiniyadi. It's on the west coast of mainland Greece, the southwest corner, in fact. Again, it's in an area where very few tourists go. There is hardly any signpost to this site. There is a great 30-foot fence around 5 miles of this site to secure it, funded by the EEC. And one person taking admissions, and when we arrived it was empty, there's nobody there. We'd heard about this city was incredibly large, 5 miles of walls, in the most sophisticated polygonal masonry. And the Greek stones differed from the Italian stones. They were slightly smaller, but they were more beautifully cut. And we was very impressed with this site.
Evo, na ovoj slici se čak nevjerojatno dobro vidi prijelaz, ovaj put ne okomiti, gdje novi zidovi idu iznad starih, nego mjesto gdje se nekakvi pravilni zidovi nastavljaju na ove nepravilne. Fotografija koja zapravo pokazuje, pretpostavljam, nadogradnju.
Well, according to the information board at Oiniyadi, the Red Tower is Hellenic, and the wall that tied in to the red Hellenic tower was polygonal. And you see that they've knitted it together. It's almost as if because they can't copy the polygonal, they could only cut squared blocks. So here they try to tie in classic Greek masonry with earlier polygonal. And this, you'll notice the masonry of this Hellenic tower is the typically long rectangular blocks and raised middles, sunken edges, which is so typical of Hellenic masonry.
Mora se reći da im je posao doista uspio dobro. Skoro da se ne vidi, skoro da se kreditna kartica ne može umetnuti niti u prostor između novog grčkog zida i starog zida od onog koga je već izgradio. Također imamo tu i zanimljiv luk. Lukovi su općenito zanimljiva pojava u zidarskim umjećima kroz povijest. Međutim, rijetko kad se vidi luk od poligonalnog kamenja.
That's right. In history, we say that the Etruscans and the Romans invented the arch. But and if you look at it, Roman and Etruscan arches, they're quite simple. But here we have a polygonal arch. These are fantastic stonemasons. They were expressing their ability to create an arch in this way was very difficult. And I haven't seen any polygonal arches anywhere in the world apart from this site at Oiniyadi. And it was a port site because on the north side of Oiniyadi had some great stone-cut harbours cut out of solid bedrock where the boats were brought in, repaired, but the sea is 5 miles away. It's no longer there. You know, the sea levels have changed. It's an expression of how old this site really is. And also there was a rock-cut amphitheatre carved out of solid rock. No stone upon stone, just a complete carving of a massive amphitheatre.
Evo i na Kreti ste našli, doduše, pomalo skroman ostatak drevne gradnje koja se pripisuje Pelazgima, međutim, ipak je tu. Koliko god da je mali.
Yes, well, the legends of the Pelasgians say that they built cities, according to Homer, they built cities in Crete. So we decided to scour the ruins of Crete to find something similar to polygonal masonry that was typical of the Pelasgians. And it was really on the very last day of 2 weeks exploring, we found a city high up above Hania in the mountains. Again, very few signposts to it, very little written about the site. But there was a polygonal wall that had been smashed, and on the other side of the city was completely wiped clean, as if a great tsunami had hit the city and destroyed it, leaving just a fragment of this incredible wall. And they also found there evidence of very, very early Greek writing, which could well be Pelasgian alphabet.
Vaša knjiga se zove Duh Portlanda. Što je to tako zanimljivo na tom poluotoku da vas je ponukalo da napišete knjigu?
Well, the spirit of Portland is about an island off the coast of England, the south coast of England. And it's fascinating because our history, you know, we are told that the Romans came and civilized us. And yet evidence shows that actually the Romans were the barbarians and we were the civilized people. But there are Roman remains on Portland. They found coffins that were typically Etruscan, buried deep in the ground on the island, for no reason at all, because these are supposed to be freestanding sarcophagi, but they were buried deep. And they're identical to 5th century BC, 500 BC coffins found all over Etruria or Tuscany. So to me there had to be some connection. And then I discovered that the islanders say that they were descended from Phoenicians. And these islanders of Portland were separate, self-governing people. The King of England, going back from Saxon times, allowed them their own independence, I believe, so that they can continue trade with European peoples without being involved with the local politics. And so Portland, the archaeology, it's full of mysterious objects, including Phoenician-looking heads, Phoenician coins, iron ingots, which was used for trade with possibly the Etruscans or the Pelasgi.
Čini se da se u trag drevne prošlosti, osim kroz kamenje, može ući i kroz sličnosti među imenima. To je jedna zabavna zanimacija. Postoje li takve poveznice između nekakvih izraza koji su danas prisutni na otočju negdje Velike Britanije generalno, koje bismo mogli povezati sa kulturama Mediterana, mediteranskog bazena i sl.?
Yes, on our research for our second book, we've been uncovering ancient sites in the north of England. Now, this area of the north of England called Cumbria and Northumbria were relatively untouched by the Romans, but they also had garrisons there of foreigners to come and help with the English against the British against the Scots. But we found that in this area of northern England, the mountain backbone of this area was called the Pennines. And it was almost the same as the Apennines of the Italians. And this area was once known as Northumbria. And the area of all the great polygonal cities of the Pelasgians is Umbria in Italy. So it's almost as if they named this place Northumbria, north of their own Umbria. But it didn't stop there. That was, you know, that's fun. But we discovered that a lot of the Iron Age kings of this area were called Tarquin. And the Etruscan princes were called Tarquin princes. So that was an interesting coincidence. But then we also explored the sacred passages of the Etruscans in Tuscany and saw identical passages in Cumbria. And we discovered in Tuscany the passages were somehow passages of the dead, where they would take the remains or the coffin of the dead through these passages on the way to their burial place. And in England we find the passages where coffins were taken through these passages of the dead. So the similar culture was sort of carried on after the Romans in this area of northern Britain, as if maybe Etruscans who were brought over, probably forced to fight against the Picts. After the Romans left, they stayed behind, intermarried, and carried on their own little sort of Umbria.
Jeste li pogledali megalitske gradove koje je hrvatski istraživač Domagoj Nikolić objedinio pod imenom megalitski gradovi Dalmacije, imajući na umu Dalmaciju kao pojam malo širi od današnjeg, znači to je bio pojam koji danas obuhvaća dio Hrvatske pa i dio Bosne. Više u smislu rimske pokrajine Dalmacije pa i Crne Gore možemo zapravo pratiti trag tih megalita i kroz Makedoniju. Jeste li pogledali neke od tih gradova poput Daursona, Meduna ili slično i jesu li se uklopili u vašu priču ili vas jednako iznenadili kao oni u Italiji?
Again, it's always surprising to find large megalithic cities anywhere, especially in Croatia and Bosnia. Darsan is a spectacular megalithic city that really should be a tourist attraction, but there's nothing there, hardly an excavation. The walls are identical to some of the early megalithic walls we've seen in other parts of Europe, particularly Greece. And some of the styles of the walls, say at Darsan and Assyria, they are very similar to the early Greek walls, probably Mycenae. But we've actually seen identical walls in Messene. And this is the interesting thing, because Messene, which is north of Kalamata and the Peloponnese, has a mountain that they say there Zeus was born. And around this mountain are 7 miles of these walls. And they are identical to the walls at Darsan and Assyria. But if you remember that these walls weren't built for defense, they were built to contain a sacred area. And I believe that these walls in Croatia were actually built to contain a sacred area. They weren't built to keep out the Iron Age hordes or Celtic tribes. They were encompassing a sacred area. And I think this explains why they put so much effort into building these magnificent walls. Because if you look at monuments all over the world that have large blocks, they're all built for ceremonial purposes, not for war. Because if you are at war, you have to build walls quickly. You know, you can't spend 50 years building a wall if your enemy is down the road. So I believe that the local people had the passion and the energy and the resources to build a sacred temple with these walls.
Mislite li da nije bilo nikakve praktične svrhe u gradnji takvih zidova? Možda neke koja nam je danas pomalo strana. Mnogi geomanti bi imali tu što za reći, s obzirom da eto, kamen i drvo su tvari koje na neki način nas povezuju sa zemljom i mnoge energije se s njima povezuju.
I think these walls have a way of holding energy, and we have found also that these sites are aligned to solar sunrises and sunsets, and we also are able to, especially my partner, to dowse earth energies, and we discovered that many of these sites are linked with the grid, the earth energies themselves. And I think rather than being walls for defense, they were certainly somehow containing the energy of the site. Because in our country there are similar hill forts to what we see at Darsan and Assyria. But because we had no great quarries there, they cut into the earth and made great ramparts. But the same, we find at these hill forts there's no evidence of warfare. They were ceremonial places, but maybe they were taken over by later cultures for war and used as defense, but their original purpose was to do with their afterlife, their charging of energies, their working with the grid to create fertility in the land. Because we find these hill forts around areas where there are great fertile plains. And it's all about food and working with the earth energies and bringing fertility to the land and happiness to them. I think these people built these cities for their own purpose, for own usage, you know, and to help with the land. And that's why a lot of them were orientated to the sun.
Možda izraz grad za te građevine i nije primjeren u smislu kako ga mi danas doživljavamo. Grad kao mjesto gdje ljudi žive, infrastruktura i slično. Do kakvih zaključaka dolazite evo nakon tolikih desetljeća gledanja ogromnog kamenja izgrađenog najnevjerojatnijim vještinom u Južnoj Americi, Sjevernoj Americi, Europi, Australiji, Egiptu, pa evo sad i u Italiji. Kakav je vaš osjećaj, zbog čega je to kamenje tako važno? Na kraju krajeva, zbog čega se danas o njemu tako malo i zna? Spomenuo bi tu poznatog povjesničara Vejdela, koji je dao poseban značaj Feničanima kakvog zapravo u povijesnim udžbenicima nema. Kakav je vaš osobni osjećaj i značaj tih otkrića?
Okay, I think, again, throughout the world, we've noticed that many of these great walls were originally built as sacred precincts, and later tribes have moved their town into these walls for protection. But again, I believe their original purposes were more for sacred usage. And all over in Peru, we find the great megalithic walls surround a temple in Cusco. And in Egypt, they are part of a religious precinct. And they're not, there's very few wall towns that have these great blocks that were actually meant to be a town. It's just that because they find the evidence of the towns inside don't date to the walls that surround them.
Mislite li da je postojala neka civilizacija koja je imala interkontinentalne kontakte s obzirom na sličnost koju vidimo primjerice između nekih zidova u Italiji i nekih zidova u Južnoj Americi, pa da ne pričamo o tragovima Egipćana navodno nađenima u Australiji, u Sjevernoj Americi? Kakva je to mogla biti civilizacija i što je se dogodilo?
Well, it's possible. I mean, that many of these cities are found near ports, near harbours, so sea peoples may have come and settled, bringing their skills of stonemasonry with them. And they do appear to be godlike people, because even in some of the sites I've seen in Croatia, they appear to be almost separate to the indigenous people, like the Illyrians. And so it's probably that they came along, they struck a deal with the locals to have part of a fertile valley in their own temples, and that they would worship the gods and live in the area themselves. But they may have been Phoenicians, because Phoenicians have known to be around for 5,000 years. And there's evidence of Phoenicians in North America, in Australia, New Zealand. It's very possible, but until now we don't know who exactly these people were. But I think as more people visit these sites and open up the history, maybe we'll discover more links and put all the jigsaw together and identify these people. Because up until now, all we can say is maybe they were Atlanteans, maybe because we know from the stories that the legends that the Atlanteans were sophisticated, intelligent people, great scientists and great stonemasons. So it's easy to think that these are Atlantean, but it may not be that way. It may be that there's a lot of cultures that were in communication with each other, because all the styles are different. The polygonal walls of Italy are different, slightly different to the ones of Greece. Even the Hellenistic walls that we've found here in Croatia are slightly different and improved to the ones in Greece. So, that each culture is adding their own style, as we do today.
Znači, za kraj nam ostaje jedno odlučno možda. Gary, hvala vam na gostovanje i do neke sljedeće prilike. Hvala Garyu Biltcliffeu, dakle, na ovom putopisnom vremoplovu u doba kojeg se više nitko ni ne sjeća. To je bilo doba dok su zaboravljeni narodi gradili svoje megalitske građevine diljem svijeta. One su i dalje ovdje, neke su vidljivije, druge su tek ostaci ili temelji slojevima civilizacija koje su ih slijedili, ratničkih carstava koja su se dizala ili propadala, nastojeći ponekad u potpunosti izbrisati tragove svojih prethodnika, ponekad radeći to i slučajno. Na svu sreću nisu uspjeli u tome, pa eto, svijet još uvijek čuva tajnovite kutke i putokaze u svijet koji se moguće temeljio na nekakvim drugačijim načelama, barem graditeljskim. Ali tko zna. Doviđenja.